In 1895, H.G. Wells wrote a very short nonfiction essay in a scientific journal, which nobody read, called The Limits of Individual Plasticity. And this is 1 year before he publishes The Island of Dr. Moreau. And in that strange little article, he suggests, having been influenced and even educated by some of the great luminaries of evolution theory, including T.H. Huxley, he suggests that animals with the new technology of surgery could be grafted, sculpted, carved, and generally sort of vivisectioned into different kinds of creatures altogether. So he talks about a transformation of one kind of creature into a radically different one. The methods, of course, would be largely surgical. He talks about grafting and transfusions. They don't know that much about genetics at this point, but they understand that mating is another option to sort of change the species over time. Now, what's interesting about that piece is, as I was reading through it, and I discovered in the footnotes a reference to experiments by Dr. John Hunter, who was a British physiologist who in the 1790s was actually grafting what he called homografts, were parts of one organism were being grafted onto the same organism, and heterografts, which were using parts from one animal and grafting them onto another. And he had a very strange experiment, which I don't know if I had the good fortune to see or just the strange luck to see in the Royal College of Surgeons in London. He managed to remove a tooth from one animal, I think it was an incisor or a canine from a predator, and he inserted it into the head of a cock, the coxcomb, sort of that fleshy bit that you see on a rooster. And he basically buried it, sort of bore a hole and buried it in there. And he had to do this many times to get it to work, but apparently what started to happen was that the head of the rooster, the capillaries joined with what was left in the tooth, and they forged a communication of blood such that the tooth continued to grow in the head of this rooster. Now, Hunter did a number of these other experiments, including grafting. He removed the testicles of some animals and then reattached them on the inside, like on the intestines, and found he didn't really have an idea of hormones, but basically what he was doing was indirectly experimenting and showing that, testosterone, for example, produced by the testicles will keep the animal acting in these sort of aggressive masculine ways, and removing it will basically create capon, which is sort of a feminized male. These experiments were all sort of done on his farm, and I think in many ways they were the kind of model for Dr. Moreau that Wells so famously wrote about. Now, what we're going to talk about today then in Monsterology are these kinds of border crossing transformations. I would call these sort of transformation horror stories, and you see them in things like The Fly, that classic Hollywood film. We see it in like Alien or The Thing. And so today we're going to talk generally about hybrids, where you take one kind of animal and another kind of animal and mix them together. Why is that so horrifying? And also, more specifically, the human and animal form of hybridization. So that's what's in store today on Monsterology. Okay, here are the images that we're going to be making today. This one is of spider and snake, kind of universal phobia. This is the face hugger from Alien, and sort of a combination of spider and snake. This is a drawing I did based on the Island of Dr. Moreau, and we're going to do that. Here's the Humanzee, part human, part chimpanzee. We're going to learn about the Humanzee. And then the Fly from the classic 1950s film with Vincent Price. So I did a combination of styles and techniques here. I'm starting out with just a pencil drawing, and then I'm going to do an ink drawing of the snake. I'm fascinated by sort of universal phobias, as many of you know who watch this channel, and spiders and snakes tend to be fairly high on the list of kind of universal human fears. This is what's called the flatty, And this little guy is one of the fastest, if not the fastest, spider that we know of. Here I'm just doing a pencil sketch and then filling it in using a number 2 pencil here that I really like on some art paper. And then I switch over to doing sort of an ink version of the snake, and then I try to combine them into this alien face hugger that many of us are familiar with from the Alien series of films. When that movie came out, the original Alien, I was a teenager, a pretty young teenager, and it scared me for like a month after seeing it. The full-grown, xenomorph is, of course, chilling and frightening, but the larval stage, the face hugger, was completely terrifying. And it, if you recall from the series, it basically penetrates the human host's throat, planting the chest bursting, juvenile in the gut of the human, and it's just grotesque and odious and a zoological mashup, really. And it's easy to imagine, that these kinds of things are just typical Hollywood, fright machine playing on our fears. But it's really interesting to consider, why are these hybrids in particular so frightening? And I think they reveal sort of important truths about human cognition and cultural evolution. We seem wired for emotional jolts, and these feelings have sort of adaptive benefits. Fear is adaptive. It keeps you away from threats. I think the fear of the face hugger and alien it may be like a vestige of ancestral primate experiences with snakes and spiders. And then the hybrid nature of the alien monster takes us sort of deeper into ourselves and history. So every culture, it seems, has monstrous mashups in their folklore and religion. These are sort of composite creatures that appear in our earliest literature, and they turn up in Upper Paleolithic cave paintings, or the Sphinx in Giza, the half-human and half-lion, maybe the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is from 2100 BC. There, the heroes of Gilgamesh and Enkidu battle a hybrid monster named Humbaba, which is described as having a lion's head and hands, but also a scaly body. Here at the drawing phase, you can see I'm basically giving myself fortifying myself with some nutrition to battle the difficult work of these drawings and to face my fears about the face hugger. Here I'm doing the face hugger drawing with a colored pencil on a toned sheet of paper with acrylic tone. And you're going to see me sort of developing this in layers, and then I roll over it with a roller with acrylic painting, and then I have to sort of dig the image back out again from that layer that I put on top of it. So again, why are sort of hybrids and these sort of taxonomic mashups so prevalent in human literature, and particularly in horror? And the argument I've sort of drawing here in part on the psychologist Dan Sperber and the anthropologist Pascal Boyer. The argument is that humans have an innate or an early developmental folk taxonomy of the world. We organize the world in predictable categories for easy understanding, and that helps us to understand the world, to think about it, and then to eventually manipulate the world. Even like as small children, we seem capable of grouping people, birds, bugs, trees, and fish together into what's called sort of natural kinds. And these are sort of objects that are similar within their category, but dissimilar across categories. So, trees are not fish, and vice versa. But if you violate those categories in literature or in imagery, it produces a tremendous cognitive and emotional arousal. And so the argument is that if you look at horror and monsters in general, you'll find a lot of this category violation and crossing boundaries, the kind of transformations I was talking about. And if you look at the face hugger, it's a beautiful combination of spider and a snake, and that really raises our fears. So here I'm starting a digital drawing now based on The Island of Dr. Moreau, which I just reread and found it absolutely wonderful. It's filled with sophisticated thinking and theorizing about evolution and animal physiology. here in the foreground you have sort of a pig man, and then some kind of frog or maybe little sort of primate creature on his shoulder, and then in the background there you see the torso of Dr. Moreau carrying a whip and a scalpel. You may recall from the story that a guy is shipwrecked on this island only to discover that there's this mad scientist, Dr. Moreau, who's been engineering animals to be more like human beings. So using surgery and transfusions, he's trying to turn animals into men. And it's a really diabolical story, and it's actually it was more philosophical and sophisticated than I thought it was going to be, so I highly recommend it. In any case, let me just finish this sort of point about why hybrids are so frightening, and particularly human and animal hybrids. We have sort of notions of slithering things and flying things, and we know what animals fit those, but if you match those together, then it violates these innate or learned categories that we have. And this violates our sort of predictive processing form of cognition. And these category violations, they sort of arouse the human mind. They basically break our expectations about the world. So we expect humans to have 2 arms, and we don't expect humans to fly, but then we find monsters that have dozens of arms, or we see flying snakes, and we call those dragons. Or, we don't see this. This is part of our folklore, of course. I'm speaking metaphorically. But when you've got these kinds of creatures, they become cognitively sticky. They basically become sticky memes, which means that people will tell those stories over and over again. They'll redraw those pictures, and they become sources of sort of cultural solidarity. It may not seem like monsters are helpful memes because they frighten us and increase stress, but they're always part of a larger cultural cautionary tale, like, the monster plays an important role in norm enforcement. If you don't follow the rules, the boogeyman will get you, or the monster will get you. If you don't walk the path of virtue, the devil will take you. If you succumb to gluttony, you'll be a hungry ghost in the next life. And so monsters function as disgusting threats, and heroes and gods, can vanquish them or repudiate them and cleanse them from the community. So this is a fairly common theme. They offer a kind of surrogate rehearsal for how the real community, us, we real humans, will sort of resist our actual enemies, whoever they happen to be. And in that sense, monsters are sticky memes that draw groups together into moral communities. What's interesting about the Island of Dr. Moreau story is H.G. Wells actually, in addition to talking about the way in which science can mold the animal body, he also is very clever in thinking about how the law can mold the moral sensibility of the creature. So, the age-old tradition is that humans have morals and animals don't. Well, Darwin sort of challenged that by saying that the seeds of morality are within animals too. And in this story by Wells, you begin to see that there's a law, and you must follow the law. What is the law? You should not walk on all fours. What is the law? Do not eat flesh or drink blood. And the animals are sort of civilized by this process of the law. But at any moment, the law, can fail, and the creatures can revert to their animal instincts. And the suggestion is that humans are also just on the verge of, this kind of reversion to our animal instincts. Here's a kind of wonderful story of the Humanzee. There's a lot of legends and stories. I'm drawing what people thought was a Humanzee in the 1970s. His name was Oscar, and he was a very odd-looking chimpanzee. When they did genetic tests on him, it turned out that he was not part human. He just was bald and walked on his hind legs, and just was sort of strange, but was within the realm of variation of chimpanzee. But evolutionary psychologist Gordon Gallup has basically claimed that the Humanzee was actually born around 100 years ago in a Florida lab where they were doing experiments, and then they were so frightened by what they'd created that they actually killed the creature. I don't know if that's been entirely corroborated, but that's sort of a well-known story. And additionally, there's been work done on the Humanzee in the Soviet Union. They claim to have created one, but the actual scientists fell out of favor with the political powers. Presumably this was the Stalin period. Again, in China, they claim to have created one, but this was at the start of the Cultural Revolution, and the whole experiment disappeared, and we don't have good data on that afterwards. What you're seeing now is another kind of hybrid that's particularly disturbing, which is when the human mixes with another animal, and in this case an insect like the fly. This is the fly from the 1950s. It's a chimera, modern science fiction chimera, where a guy inadvertently mixes himself with a common housefly. And you'll see that you can't just sort of violate categories of human and animal. It really helps the horror if one of the creatures really produces disgust ordinarily in humans. So flies produce disgust, and you can see it in this drawing of Vincent Price fighting the creature. You really need that kind of additional affective or emotional dimension, I think, not just a simple taxonomic category violation. Maybe the last major topic on this worth mentioning is that there is growing experiments in Japan and here in the States too, where we're mixing human cells together with animal tissues within animal embryos. So for example, human tissues have been added to rat and mouse embryos and then let develop. Now the scientists claim that they haven't let the organism develop to term, and they terminate the development like after so many days, but who knows really. And what's fairly creepy about that is that if the goal is to mix human cells and animal embryos together enough that you could grow human organs within animals and then harvest those if humans needed them. Now that's creepy and weird enough, but one of the major ethical concerns is that, what if human cells stray beyond the sort of development of the targeted organ, and they travel to the developing animal's brain and potentially affect its cognition? That's really frightening. Not only could it increase the intelligence of the organism, but even perhaps more troubling is the idea that it could increase consciousness or self-awareness within the creature, which is something that I think has all kinds of ethical implications. Anyway, that's enough for today's episode of Monsterology, a look at the horror and terror of chimeras or hybrid creatures. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please hit the subscribe button and come back for more content. Thanks a lot.